As a portrait photographer, I vividly remember the first time I encountered ISO on my photography journey. I was a beginner eager to capture stunning portraits, but I found myself puzzled by this seemingly cryptic acronym. Was it some complex technical jargon, or a secret code that only professional photographers knew? Let me take you on a journey to demystify ISO and understand its significance in photography. ISO in photography determines how much light your camera's sensor needs to capture a well-exposed image. ISO, which stands for International Organization for Standardization, is a measure of the sensitivity of your camera's image sensor to light. It originated from the film photography days when films with different sensitivities to light were labeled with ISO ratings. And before we dive into how ISO affects your images, it's first important to understand the role that ISO plays within the exposure triangle. Also, it's important to note that in this guide, everything I'm referring to is when you put your camera in manual shooting mode, which allows you to control the ISO, aperture, and shutter speed manually. Understanding ISO is crucial because it's closely tied to two other key elements in photography: aperture and shutter speed. The trio of ISO, aperture, and shutter speed forms what's called the exposure triangle. The exposure triangle determines the brightness, sharpness, and overall quality of your photos. We've covered what ISO is, which determines the sensitivity of the sensor to light. So what are aperture and shutter speed? Aperture refers to the size of the camera's aperture opening, which controls the amount of light that enters the camera. Shutter speed, on the other hand, determines the length of time that the camera's sensor is exposed to light. All three components work together to affect the exposure of the image. They are all used to balance the exposure out. So in the case of ISO, it will act as a tool to balance the exposure in shooting situations where aperture and shutter speed alone may not provide the desired exposure results. For example, in a low light situation where using a wider aperture such as f1.8 or f2.4, or a longer shutter speed such as under 1/100 would result in a blurred image, then increasing the ISO could help achieve a properly exposed photo without sacrificing image quality. Conversely, in a bright outdoor situation where you may need to use a narrow aperture, which is a higher f-stop number, or a faster shutter speed to control the amount of light entering the camera, then lowering the ISO could help prevent overexposure and maintain image quality. As a photographer, experimenting with different combinations of ISO, aperture, and shutter speed in different shooting conditions can help you understand how they work together and how to use them effectively to achieve the desired exposure and image quality for your photos. Now that we've covered how ISO plays its part in the exposure triangle, let's take a look at all the ways ISO affects a photo. ISO affects your photo in three main ways. The first way ISO affects your photos is through the overall exposure of your image. As we've touched on in the previous section, ISO is one of the three components in the exposure triangle. When you increase the ISO, you're essentially making your camera sensor more sensitive to light, allowing your camera to capture more light and produce a brighter image. Conversely, lowering the ISO number makes the camera sensor less sensitive to light, resulting in a darker image. This means that if you're photographing in a situation where there's not much light, such as at night or an indoor situation, then increasing the ISO can be beneficial as it will allow you to capture a properly exposed image without having to rely on a longer shutter speed or wider aperture. On the other hand, if you're photographing a bright outdoor situation, you may want to use a lower ISO setting so you don't have a blown out, overexposed image. The second way ISO affects your photos is through image quality. When I first started using ISO, I made the mistake of cranking it up to the highest value, thinking it would make my photos brighter. But I soon realized that higher ISO settings can introduce unwanted noise or grain in photos, resulting in decreased image quality. On the other hand, using a lower ISO setting in low light situations can result in an underexposed, dark image. It was clear that I needed to strike the right balance with ISO to achieve the best results. As a photographer, it's important to be mindful of the trade-offs between higher ISO settings for brighter exposures and potential noise in your images. I recommend practicing and familiarizing yourself with your camera's ISO performance to understand its limitations, so that when you're out on a photo shoot, you have a general idea of what ISO to use without getting grain or noise. And one thing I had to come to grips with as a photographer is that if your camera can't handle high ISO well, and you like to shoot in dark or low light situations such as nightclubs or concert venues, then you either need to get a better camera that handles higher ISOs better without producing noise, or find a light source in your current low light settings. We've already been discussing noise or grain, which is a byproduct of taking an image with a very high ISO, but I wanted to dive into it a bit more. The presence of noise or grain in an image can be a creative choice or a distraction, depending on the type of photography you're doing and the desired aesthetic. Some photographers like to take a perfectly sharp image and then add artificial grain in post-production to give it that film or vintage look. Many photographers even joke that, we have all this high-end post-production equipment now where you can remove every single grain and camera lenses that capture sharp images. However, some people still like to add noise or grain intentionally to their images, which is something I like to do as well. Some photographers also intentionally use a higher ISO setting to achieve a grainy or gritty look in their photos to add some moodiness or nostalgia to the image. This is perfectly fine when you're taking a photo for your own pleasure, whether it's a street photograph, a portrait, a landscape, or whatever. In fact, I'd recommend trying this out just so you can further explore your own camera's ISO limitations and what the noise or grain will look like at different ISO values. On the other hand, if you're taking a portrait or a wedding photo for a client, then you'll want to probably capture a more professional, fine detail, smooth-toned image. In this case, a higher ISO setting for creative effects may not be desirable, as it can affect the overall image quality.